Buonasera, benvenuti.
Good evening. Welcome. I'll say just a few words before leaving you with Bruce Sterling and his lecture. He is one of the best, most well-known thinkers in the concept of utopia. Utopia is something that we are no longer getting used to, even in what is the fantasy literary word. Everything is a dystopia, not a positive utopia. So let's speak about Italy. Today, we really badly need utopias. And this is outside literature. We are speaking about a recent survey that is telling us that Italians are blind towards the future. We undervalue the economical and social processes that are leading us to a catastrophe. And this survey is telling us that replacing the old with new is no longer possible. We are losing our young generation in underpopulation. It will be 8 million in 2050. So Italy is no longer having young people and babies, and we are losing a market of new feelings and emotions. So we are multiplying the chaos, emergency, and fear, climate change, and poverty, and war, and everything that is happening, migration, and terrorism as well. This is multiplying and creating a scenario that is not helping us to find solutions, to find a future, and therefore we are becoming sleepwalkers, people that are not thinking about the future anymore. We rest in what we can get, so small pleasures. We live day by day. We no longer have families because we don't have time for that. And so let's think about solar punk and the sci-fi literature that is speaking about utopia, not dystopia. Dystopia has colonized our reality. We are glued to a dystopia, eternal present. This is already our dystopy. But let's think about Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher back in the day. We are now feeling the consequences of this era. So this is why I would like to quote a writer, Sandra Newman. She's the author of two novels, I cieli e gli uomini, translated into Italian, so Skies and Men's. She's dreaming about utopia. She's quoting Plato and Thomas More and Camelot. Those were all utopias and ideas that the story of man started in Eden and will be in heaven in a way. We are living a catastrophe that is the breeding ground of dystopia, but we need to regain our utopias, our life. If we have a 17th century visitor, is a realized utopia because we have a long lifespan. We have sometimes a gender balance. We can do better. We have schools. We are helping people that are disabled. We have a healthcare system. We are helping migrants sometimes. And we suffer when someone is asking for help and is not given help. So we have a sort of humanity. And Newman is saying there's nothing childish into thinking that the world could be better, into wanting a better world. We need to leave behind this idea of Orwellian dystopy. History is telling us, is teaching us that good intentions are not a failure. Good intentions are good. We need to allow ourselves to dream the utopia, and we need to act pragmatically to turn utopia into our truth. Bruce Sterling, over to you.
Thank you. I'll steal her microphone because I know it works. So thanks for coming to see me. And as Laura Donna just pointed out, I am Bruce Sterling. And here to deliver my speech about realistic utopias, the public utopia and the private utopia. And this would be the hero of my remarks today because he's the world's biggest expert on utopia. He's called Raphael Hythlodius. And the Italian editions of the book Utopia, he's Raffaello Itlo Deo. Raffaello is a fictional character. He's imaginary, but he is the narrator of the book Utopia. And here's a picture of Raffaello personally meeting Sir Thomas More and Sir Thomas More's friend and host, Peter Gillis, in the year 1515. The book was published 500 years ago in the Latin language, and the author was Sir Thomas More. But Thomas More was a lawyer. He was not a novelist. And in the book, he claims that he's simply writing down the testimony of Raphael Hetelodias. So the author is Raphael, according to Thomas. So the novel was a kind of a hoax or a joke that Thomas More invented while he was on vacation. The book happened because he had to leave England on business, and he had to leave his private home and his beloved family and take part in public life as a diplomat for the King of England. So he had to go meet some Spanish officials in the city of Bruges on the European continent. So he left, and he dutifully went to Europe, but after some weeks of diplomatic struggle, he realized that the negotiations were going nowhere. I mean, the negotiations were basically fake because the King of England and King of Spain were quarreling, and they had no intention of ever reaching an agreement. So, in fact, Thomas More just had to spend 6 months of his life in Europe pretending to be a diplomat and a lawyer, and he was never going to do anything. So he was a bit upset by this. So he left the city of Bruges where nothing was happening, and he went to Antwerp instead, and Versa, because he had a friend there. And his friend was a fellow scholar named Peter Gillis, or Giles. And Peter Gillis was an Antwerp city official. He was in government, and he was quite well-to-do, a very well-connected guy. And so he could play host to Sir Thomas More, and Thomas More was welcome to stay in his house for no money and eat his food for no money and just be an honored house guest for several months. So Thomas More and Peter Gillis, in this private home, avoiding actual work, they have many private discussions which are all about law and business and money and economics and politics and the state of the world, and they both agree it's pretty terrible. State of the world, pretty bad. Not a utopia at all. In fact, the first part of the book, Utopia, is pretty much all dystopia. It's about how bad things in Europe are. And it's rather realistic, too. It's not imaginary. So Thomas More and Peter Gillis together decide to invent this wandering scholar named Raphael Hetelodias. And Raphael can speak Latin and Greek just like them. But Raphael has been to a country where everything works. And Peter Gillis even invents a utopian alphabet and writes some utopian poetry just to demonstrate that he can play this fun utopia game with his guest Thomas More. He's willing to cooperate. He even pretends to introduce Raphael Hetelodias to Thomas More. So Raphael appears, and he starts talking, and he recites the entire book. I mean, he speaks the book, Utopia. It's 30,000 words long. So Raphael recites this entire book in one afternoon. It's a 3.5-hour lecture, and Thomas More writes it all down, every word. But it's not boring. It's not a boring lecture, no, because Raphael Hetelodias, quite an amazing guy. He doesn't look rich or famous. Basically, he looks like a sailor. Just got a beard, he's kind of weather-beaten. He's a long-haired wanderer in beat-up clothes. He says that he's from Portugal. He's a native of Portugal. But somehow, he's been to Persia and Ceylon, spent rather a lot of time in Belgium. He's been to Brazil. He knows England very well. Raphael Hythlodaeus knows the Archbishop of Canterbury personally. So if you read the book carefully, it turns out that Raphael Hythlodaeus left Portugal, went to Brazil to explore the New World, crossed South America, somehow crossed the Pacific Ocean, discovering several new countries that nobody ever heard of, and he returned to Portugal after visiting Ceylon. So Raphael Hythlodaeus has circled the entire world several years before Ferdinand Magellan tries to circle the entire world. He's the first guy to ever go around the world. You know, why? Why did he do it? Well, basically, it's because he's a tourist. He derives no political or economic benefit from all this wandering. He had a lot of money once, he said, but he just gave all the money away, gave it to members of his family, to friends. He refuses to serve in the government, even though he speaks Greek, he speaks Latin, he understands law, he understands economics, super knowledgeable guy. He doesn't want to serve in government because he says it's slavery. There's no reason you would ever want to do it. You know, Hythlodaeus is basically a dropout hippie backpacker. He's a refusenik. He despises power and wealth. He's like rigorously anti-materialistic. He's an intellectual dissident. He's not a pilgrim of any religious faction. He doesn't have any trade. He has no career skills. He's not a lawyer. He's not a banker. He's not a patriot. He's never going back to Portugal. Cut his ties with them. Any town is good enough for him. Antwerp is fine. He's happy to be in Antwerp. Has no reason to be there. He's just in Antwerp talking to Sir Thomas More. He has no wife. He has no mistress. Has no children, no grandchildren. He has no duties. He never has to change clothes. Every day, he says, he just does whatever he likes. He just does whatever he likes. So that's Raphael Hythlodaeus, the most utopian figure in the book Utopia. He's a one-man utopia. He's a personal utopia because he makes a utopia all by himself, just for himself. And in this struggle between the private, personal utopia and the political, organized utopia, that's there in the very beginning of the book Utopia. So in the book, Raphael says that he lived with the utopians for 5 years. He knows everything there is to know about them, studied them very closely. He knows the utopian language. He knows their alphabet, their history, their military, their judiciary, their economic system, their justice system. He knows how they educate the youth, how they raise crops, what they eat, how they dress, the transportation system, everything. Just comprehensively knows everything about that society. So Thomas More and Peter Gillis, they buy lunch for him. Just ask him over to the house, they give him something to eat, and after they eat, Raphael, he's happy to tell them everything there is to know about the utopian system. He asks no pay, no reward. Doesn't want any credit in the book. He just delivers utopia to them. And then Raphael Hythlodaeus just disappears. He has complete existential freedom. He just drifts around the planet like the wind. He's a utopian tourist. He's a traveling one-man show. He's like an exile on planet Earth. So he's a fictional character, and the book Utopia is a fictional book, but Thomas More was a very real person. He was making up this Utopia game and making up Hythlodaeus, mostly in order to amuse his host, Peter Gillis, who was feeding him and sheltering him the whole time. But Thomas More ran out of vacation time. He was on vacation in Antwerp. He had to go back to England. He had to return to his home and resume his career as a working lawyer. He had no more time ever to write any fiction. He never wrote fiction again. He wrote a lot of government tracts. He wrote sermons, legal opinions, no fiction ever. And after about a year, More bundled up some papers that he had about Utopia, and he sent them to Peter Gillis. And he said, I have no time to mess with this game anymore. Why don't you see if you can do something with it? I mean, you participated. Just do anything you want with this Utopia project. Maybe Erasmus can help. That would be Desiderio Erasmus of Rotterdam, famous scholar. So Erasmus did help. He helped Peter Gillis, and they published Utopia, but only in Europe. The book was a private joke for Thomas More. He was busy with his public life. This is him. This is the author here. He's rapidly rising in the ranks of the British government. In the first edition of Utopia, you can see that Erasmus is basically the editor. And he's also added a lot of his own witty epigrams. So I was like, it has things that Erasmus said that were like funny and intriguing, because Erasmus knows this book is pretty strange, and he's trying to increase some sales by putting in his own remarks. But, Thomas More doesn't care. He's not a fiction writer. He's not even a scholar. He's basically working for the government. He's prosperous, and he builds a grand private mansion for himself and his family. And the book Utopia, not published in England, not while More was alive. The English knew practically nothing about it. Very few people in England had ever heard that Thomas More once wrote a novel. So here's Thomas More in his private life. It's a sketch of a portrait that he's working on. He's got a gold chain around his neck because he's become the Chancellor of England. But his private life is of great concern to him. And this is Thomas More writing many careful hand notes on this sketch, because it's a portrait of his entire household, like all his relatives and also his household retainers gathered in his house. It's really quite a nice private house. It's got a very high-tech clock, if you look at it, flower bouquets, curtains, and all the women in this portrait have books because they're all literate. He's like educated every woman in his house. They understand Latin, they can write Greek, they know astronomy, music, mathematics. They're some of the most highly educated women in the world. He educated them privately in the home. Women could not go to school, but he just pulled in the best scholars and had them give lessons to his wife and his daughters and retainers and anybody who's listening there. So More's private house is a kind of utopian university. This is the eventual painting, which was made from the sketch. And the fellow in red, that's Thomas More's father. He was also a lawyer. He was also involved in politics. But he got involved in a serious controversy, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. That was Dad's experience. He had to go to the Tower of London for a month. Terrible place, a dungeon. Political opponents of the English regime, they're tortured and sometimes murdered in the Tower of London. Very sinister place. And 1 month of that Tower of London prison experience, I was plenty for Dad. Dad retired from public life immediately. He never sought political power again. He just goes back to the house with Thomas More and the very educated girls. Plenty to do in there. It's nice. There's carpets, dogs, nice clothes, got some messengers, like a scholar in the back doing some mail. It's so civilized that it's like a different world. Then the author of Utopia himself gets into some very serious and realistic political trouble. because the King of England is divorcing his wife, who is a Spanish princess, and he's removing England from the Catholic Church. It's basically a Brexit situation. He's just seceding from Christendom and declaring himself the spiritual head of the British Church, English Church. Thomas More does not approve of this. He's a very pro-European diplomat. He knows the idea is terrible. There's going to be nothing but trouble from it. He tries to be diplomatic with the king. He gets all kinds of legal arguments. This isn't wise. But, King Henry VIII, he's determined to marry 6 different women. It's realpolitik. It's a political crisis. The king's not going to back down. More leaves power. He just goes to his private house with like his dad. I'm not in the government, he declares. I want nothing to do with the government. I don't seek power. I don't want wealth. But his private life cannot protect him. The regime insists that he has to sign a public declaration that the king has moral authority over the Pope. He's just required to sign it. And it's a very long, painful controversy. He doesn't want to sign. He's fighting on principle. I'm a private citizen. I'm in my own home. I want nothing to do with politics. You can't make me sign public documents against my will. But that struggle doesn't end well. Because this is a painting of the author of Utopia getting arrested in the front, with members of his family clinging to him. Don't take Dad from our house. And then in the back, he's getting publicly executed, heads chopped off with an axe on a block. And the details here are interesting. The realism of what really happened to this utopian author. They cut his head off his body in public, but one of the daughters managed to collect his body, but she didn't get the head. The head got boiled in a pot in order to kind of preserve it, kind of sterilize it. And then it was painted with tar. His head was painted with pitch as a kind of preservative. And then the head of the author of Utopia got stuck on a long spike on the London Bridge. This was customary justice in England at the time. This definitely happened to Thomas More. His head was definitely placed on one of those spikes on the top of the arched bridge you can see there. And after a month of public exposure of the author's head on a spike, the legend says that one of his other daughters somehow managed to collect his head. She got the head off the spike, even though the head was supposed to be thrown into the river, because that's what you did with traitors. She had no house because he was a traitor and the house had been confiscated. So she's homeless, but she's somehow clever, very well-educated woman, speaks Greek, speaks Latin, understands astronomy, music, mathematics. She's a woman of the world. Somehow she manages to bribe the keeper of the heads, and she gets her father's head and carries it away. It's not clear what happened to the head. There are a number of varieties about what she did with it after she got it. But, to my mind, this is the ultimate realist utopian image. If somebody says utopia to you, you should think an adult woman smuggling the severed head of her father away from an execution site. That's what it's like. You write Utopia, and your grieving daughter somehow steals your chopped off head and smuggles your head away in a bag. Okay, now we forget about Thomas More for the rest of the presentation because he's dead. And meanwhile, there's Italy. Yes, Italy. Nobody cares about his head being cut off. But they are reading Utopia because Italians, turns out, they love Utopia. They read Thomas More's book in Latin. And they understand that this is speculative political fiction. It's really an interesting thing to do. And there's even a kind of fantascienza genre of utopian writing, not in England, but in Italy. Like Campanella's book. There's a whole set of them here. by various people who aren't English. You know, it's the no English people here. They know your head comes off, okay? You don't want to mess with it. But there's all these other guys writing Utopias. There's Campanella. His book's still in print. You can go buy it. Kind of interesting. And there's Agostini. He's still of some interest to scholars there. It's like imaginary republic. It's like, what a good idea. This is Anton Francesco Doni. He's probably the weirdest authors of Utopias. This is the Utopia written by Doni. It's the one that's most like science fiction. I mean, it's just literally a weird book, kind of meant to be funny and entertaining. You know, like Doni's quite an odd character. Here's an Italian political anthology where many political writers are describing the real politics of real places. And in the end, they just throw in Thomas More's Utopia, right? Just include it in the book. I mean, why not? Does it even matter if it's an imaginary country, right? It's about the principles of understanding countries. Like, how do you describe them? Like, how do you describe what they work? Okay, now we come to a political writer who understands Thomas More. He likes to quote Thomas More. He's Catholic like Thomas More, Latin scholar. However, he's extremely realistic, a real political realist. This is Giovanni Botero. He wrote a book which was a kind of utopian manifesto, but for the city of Torino. Yeah, this is the utopian Torino, and here's this street here in town. It's over in the Quadrilatero, the oldest part of the town, Botero Street. And I was like, yeah. And here's this book, which is all about politics, and it has an afterword, a political book about government, and a work of analysis about cities, like how do you build a grand and magnificent city? Like there's a lot of cities in the world, how do you make one grand and magnificent? You know, what if Torino was magnificent and grand? I mean, how would you make a small town in Piemonte magnificent and grand? I mean, what policy would you pursue? What would you do? Right? How could rulers take policy steps to achieve grand magnificence? So you might think this is clearly a utopian idea. I mean, why would Torino ever be grand? Because this is what Torino looked like when Botero was writing about it and urging to make it magnificent and grand. It's not magnificent and grand. It's just a small, typical Piedmontese town. It's like Asti, Carrasco, you know, Bra. No city in Piemonte has ever been grand, says Botero. He happens to be from Piemonte, but he knows the history of the region. There's just never been a big town in Piemonte ever. There's no town like Genova or, you know, Vicenza or Roma, certainly. It's just never been a grand, magnificent town. Why not? Well, Giovanni Botero is very keen on studying history and geography and law and economics and demographics and other disciplines that did not have names in his time. But he sort of took the lesson of Utopia about how to imagine the town as a whole and get it to work. And what happens in his book, his pamphlet really, is that Botero has learned to think in a utopian way that is realistic. You can really do it. He doesn't say Torino will be grand. He says, what are the general principles of cities becoming grand? And so this is Torino as kind of Carrasco. It's charming in Carrasco. I've been to Carrasco. It's very nice, actually. I always enjoy it there. Carrasco, you know, the world capital of snails. If you've ever been to Carrasco, you know, the Festa della Lumiche, you know, the Lumiche, you know, they're great. I mean, they're slow food. You like slow food? Like Lumiche, really, really slow. It's fabulous. I love them. And that is Torino without Giovanni Botero. Without Giovanni Botero, it's basically Carrasco. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss Botero's ideas in detail, but I promise you, if you read his book, you will understand Torino much, much better. It was a very successful book, reprinted all over Europe, as you can see. He makes a very practical case for grandeur and magnificence. You don't do it on a whim. There are political reasons to do it. Botero says, To maintain a living city, you need three things. First, you need cheap bread. Not just bread, but enough that it's cheap economically, plenty to eat. And second, you need peace, because the city is under siege all the time and people are getting killed and it's some mere struggle for survival. That won't really allow the town to function. It just won't be able to work. And third, you need justice, so that the population doesn't cut each other's throats and there's not civil war in the streets and people can get on with their productive business. So he says that peace, bread, and justice are the basic necessities, but that they're very difficult to maintain. Often they will fail. And the city will suffer a setback. But if the city is grand and magnificent, people will return. You will attract people with a spirited imagination who can appreciate the grandeur and the magnificence. And that is the quality of urban people that you actually want. That's why you do it. So that was Botero's plan. And unlike Thomas More, Botero did not get killed. He could have been killed because life in the ducal court of Savoy was very dangerous. But he was allowed to retire with dignity here in Torino. And when he died in Torino, he had the pleasure of seeing that indeed the town was becoming grand rather quickly. So, that's what a realistic utopia looks like as a political success on an urban scale. But, what about the private utopia? I mean, Botero shows us how to do it as a politician and kind of get away with your plans. But about our friend Raphael Hythlodaeus here, he doesn't want to do any politics. Does he also have a possible victory condition? I actually think he does. Like the homemade private utopia. Just one fellow, one wandering sailor, no great wealth, rather modest resources. If he has determination, he can lead a surprisingly different life on private principles, even in the 20th century. So this is the American artist Alexander Calder, very inventive fellow. Spent a lot of time in Europe, Alexander Calder, and he was a sailor for quite a while, much like Raphael Hythlodaeus, kind of dressed in rags, had a beard, not much money. Kind of wandering dropout, guy with one pair of shoes. Paris bohemian artist, spent some time in Montmartre. And in this picture, Alexander Calder decides to build his private dream home out of this wreckage here. Kind of a big dead building. Luckily, he has Mrs. Calder to help him out. He's not completely alone. Mrs. Calder here, Louisa James Calder, she happens to be a cultured Boston aristocrat who speaks excellent French and has a lot of social contacts. And her family said that she was looking for a different way of life, and when she married him, boy, did she ever get one. So here she is making some French bread while Calder's reading some art book. But if you're a design critic, you would notice this is a very peculiar kitchen. A very peculiar kitchen. And here's a photograph of his other house in France. Calder probably made about half the furniture in this room. His wife made the rugs. She was helping out. She liked to make carpets. This is his studio. People said it looked like an airplane had crashed into it. He had some kind of unique personal filing system. There are eyewitness reports of him. He did not regard this as a disturbed environment. This was his idea of efficiency, actually, and he was a very efficient artist. He made 20,000 artworks in these studios over a 50-year career. There are eyewitness accounts of him grabbing his tools, grabbing pieces of stuff, never misplacing anything. Nothing ever got lost in there. It's just kind of a private, very weird, and very personal studio. This is a Calder handmade bread toaster. Why, would you need a toaster? You could just buy a toaster, right? And this one's obviously dangerous. I mean, And it's made out of scrap, right? It's not even made of industrial components. It's made of bits of wood, leftover pieces of stone. I mean, I've looked at it a lot. I've tried to figure out why he would do it. Okay, he built 5 of these. 5 completely different toasters, right? It's like, why not just go buy the toaster? Well, you know, he wants to hand make a toaster. He just wants his toaster. Like a different toaster, the one that kind of belongs to him. I mean, it's really a utopian device in the sense of something that's far-fetched and silly and kind of makes no sense. Utopian in that way. It's just not practical, but it's practical for him. I mean, Calder tended to make art out of objects that the world had abandoned. You know, kind of the Turinese arte povera method. You just like find junk and kind of dress it up and or reformat it. And he had a different value system. I mean, to him, this is not junk. To him, this is him struggling to understand a toaster. Here he's making forks, right? It's like, I mean, I'm trying to figure this out. It's like, why would anyone go to the trouble to make a fork, right? Especially out of wire. These are wire forks that he hammered flat so they would behave more like forks. And I think what happens here, I mean, he liked hand tools. People called him a machine artist because he made sculptures that moved and sometimes had motors. But he only had 2 machines in his studio, a drill and a grinder. He had no other machines. He liked making personal things with his hands, tools in his hands. So he's sitting and he's eating with a fork and he realizes, this is a tool in my hand. This fork is a tool in my hand. Why isn't it my personal fork? Why doesn't this fork have more of my values, right? I mean, it's a utopian fork. It's just like my personal, very different fork. I don't care how long it takes me to make it. I want it to express, I want to hold it in my hand and eat with it. It's not for sale. These are not commodities. They just are what they are. They're like artifacts from a very different value system. He was a successful artist. At the end of his life, he was quite a wealthy man. And after he died, then his heirs were very wealthy indeed by artistic standards. His home in France is an art center now. You can go there and make art in his studio and so forth. So, you know, these may not quite look like utopian objects because they're so personal, but it's probably what a handmade personal utopia actually has to look like. I mean, you really have to dig down to the original basic principles there. It has the freedom of Raphael Hythlodaeus. It's intelligent, it's erudite, it's well-traveled, and the rules of the world do not apply to it. They just don't apply. Utopia fide te. It's a house utopia. It's a homemade utopia. You know, could you do this yourself? I mean, personally, if you like left the speech, it's like, great, I'm going to go home and make my own fork. Right? You could. It's not impossible. You could do it. I mean, he did it. He's proving to himself that he can do it. It's just very rare. Why do you need a personal utopia? Why does that matter to you? Where is the benefit? Why not just buy the same toaster that the guy next door has? You know, Raphael Hythlodaeus, he could go back to Portugal. He could get a job. He could get married. He could work for the Duke. Now, the private utopia, it's like one man trying to do everything that the world can do for you. And also, Calder's alone in the countryside. He's not in the city. He doesn't have any critics watching him make forks. But, you know, what about the city? Look at those things. I don't even know what those are. He made many of them, maybe hundreds. What about the city full of people? I mean, what about utopian city of Torino, grand and magnificent, the Turinese realistic utopia? What about it? Okay, I have some passing ideas on that subject, mostly because I have read Giovanni Botero, and he wants to use grand magnificence to attract people into the town. That's why he says it's about. A town that can survive, not because it's really good at snails. Like, you don't need the snails, really. But because it has glamour and charisma. I mean, that's why you want to do it. And it's pretty clear that, to me, that this realistically is what Torino has been doing for much of my lifetime. It was a city that suffered economic setbacks in the 1970s and was having trouble with like the food and the justice system and so forth. But when the heavy manufacturing failed, it has been slowly trending toward art, design, and especially tourism and heritage tourism. The Baroque architecture in Turin has not been this sexy in 300 years. It's really an international tourist draw. It's becoming like a Turinese Firenze, slowly. I mean, you have to visit it over a long period to see this urban transformation, but it's really happening. And it's not a traditional utopia because it's basically about attracting tourists. But tourists are utopian, mostly because they're struggling to escape from their real lives. They're dying from too much realism, the harsh reality of their crushing lives. They want to experience something that feels different and refreshing, if only for 2 weeks. Now, the problem here is that Torino is progressive, but the Turinese heritage industry, which is very attractive, has no avant-garde. You can't do futuristic heritage industry, right? You can't move forward into the past, supposedly. You can't show anybody any new past. You can only show them the past that's always been there and has somehow survived. You can't show them a novel past that no one has ever seen. However, if you wanted to be realistic and utopian, you might actually do this. And while Giovanni Botero was alive and writing about how to build Torino, this was Torino's most grand and magnificent building. And everybody in Torino knew this building. It was the Mole Antonelliana of medieval Turin. This is it, the Tower of St. Gregory, the tallest tower in Turin, right in the middle of the quadrilatero where you would reasonably put a very tall tower. Giovanni Botero saw this tower every day. Everybody in Torino saw this tower every day. If he was alive among us in this room, he'd be horrified to realize it was gone. It would be a tragic loss. A Torino with no civic tower? Scarcely a real Torino at all. And if it was actually here, I mean, this is kind of the remnant of it. There have been attempts to restore it. This is kind of the most recent failed attempt to put the civic tower back. Okay, this does not attract tourists. I don't understand why the Turinese even allow this thing here. It's kind of the stub of the original tower. It's just there because nobody can do anything with that urban space. But if it was here, it would certainly be a very big tourist attraction. It happened to be demolished in the year 1801. Napoleon knocked it down. And there were efforts to rebuild it, like this stump of it, still here. But there's no economic reason to really rebuild it, or there didn't seem to be. But if you did restore it from like a utopian impulse, you could offer it to tourists as a new heritage building. And you could do it because the city of Torino has excellent archives. There are all kinds of records about exactly what this tower looked like in the 500 years that it towered over Torino. And the Turinese are very used to restoring partially damaged buildings. They do that all the time. Why not just restore the entire building? Why not just be bold and inventive and utopian and realistic and make a completely vanished building come back? This grand, magnificent tower has been gone since 1801, but now it's back again. It was history, but now it's a new historical tower. You know, it's not illegal to do it. I mean, physically, it wouldn't even be that expensive to do it, certainly not by the standards of many other ambitious Turinese urban projects. It is just custom and the habit of mind that makes you think that old buildings can't suddenly spring back to life out of the records. Of course they can. Now, the relics in the Egyptian Museum, for instance, they're not really Egyptian. They've been Turinese for 200 years. And tourists love those Turinese Egyptian relics. So when I started this speech, I said that Raphael Hytlodaeus was a tourist, and he was. I mean, he went to see Utopia, he took a lot of notes, he never settled in Utopia, never married a Utopian woman, he never emigrated to Utopia, he didn't ask for Utopian citizenship, he just witnessed Utopia and then he lectured about it. But there is no Utopia for tourists. If you've ever been a tourist, you know it's actually a rather dystopian user experience. I mean, the experience is more or less horrible. Maybe you want to go to another country, right? You're a tourist. You want to experience a different way of life. You want refreshment. You want escape from your reality. Well, first you go to the airport where you're treated as a terrorist. They literally go through your luggage, your shoes. Then you reach the border, and there you're treated as a clandestino or maybe a smuggler. They're extremely suspicious and hostile. And those are not even realistic efforts. They don't really serve the cause of law enforcement or civil order. They're actually systems which are built for intimidation. They're just there to make you feel worse and to be sorry that you decided to travel. They're in place to hurt your feelings. And then as a tourist, when you're a tourist in a foreign city, everyone hates you. Attempts are made to tell you to enjoy yourself and to eat the expensive food and spend some money on nice clothes, but there's very little there that's for your actual benefit. I mean, that's all just basically advertisements. The local people simply want the cash. They don't want you around. And for good reasons. When masses of tourists arrive in your city, like you're a really successful tourist city, it's like the city dies wherever they step. There doesn't seem to be any civilized way to deal with them. Even if you're a tourist, you hate the other tourists. Now, these are the people within your city who realistically need a utopia. You don't need a utopia. They need the utopia. If you're a native of the city, you're used to the city. You cherish the city. You're a patriot. You want to live in the city with your memories, your urban experiences that make it your place, your city. You don't want your city to be a utopia, not even your own backyard. I mean, if someone said, make San Donato a utopia, right? Everyone in San Donato would immediately say, make Campidoglio do it. Make Cheat Turin do it, not us. And then they would force San Salvario to become the utopia because San Salvario is full of foreigners and they never know what to say. So if you want to build a utopia realistically, you should build one for tourists. I'm not sure what that would look like. I could speculate about it a little. I think it would be mostly psychological, actually. It would be like a wellness retreat, a kind of spa. And so I'm thinking some large Turinese building, like a derelict factory, empty, like the Cavallerizza, or the former OGR, the dead train repair yard, just some derelict space, a big utopian box. It should be soundproofed. It should be airtight, like a gambling casino. No clocks are visible. There are no windows. The air should be filtered because the air in Torino is terrible. And there are hundreds of tourists inside this utopian box, maybe thousands of tourists in there. It costs nothing to get into the box. It's a free public amenity. But to get into this utopia, they have to remove their phones. They have to remove their clothing. They have no wallets, no purchase, no money, no identity, no passports. They have to remove themselves. That's the key to it. They're free not to be who they are. What's in there? Nothing. There's nothing to buy. There are no thrill rides, no multilingual experiences. I think the tourists themselves should probably disappear. They should be wearing special effects suits like this that cause people to vanish. They blend into whatever is projected on the walls, and I think that projection is probably Torino. Just dreamlike images of Torino, not the real Torino with Turinese people in it, but a tourist utopian Torino. The 1850s, the 1920s. There's no plot, nothing happens, there's no thrill ride, nothing bothers you, everything is under surveillance. You're a tourist, you're just peacefully drifting around in this foreign space, and you're foreign. You could sleep in there if you want. Most tourists, they don't really want thrills or excitement. They are tourists to escape the everyday trauma of their miserable lives. They're not moving toward the attractions. They're running away from their suffering. So they should be in there and they should vanish. Nobody has to look at them. They're in Utopia. Eventually they come out, then maybe they spend some money before they go home. Okay, now I'll close with a few words. I've spent a lot of time in Torino myself, sometimes on a tourist visa, but I have never once been on vacation in Torino. Never. I never had a job here. I don't labor here. I'm not a voter. I don't participate politically. I don't stare at the sights. I don't even eat the tourist food. For my wife and myself, Torino's our city of romance. We had known about each other for rather a long time, but Torino is where we first met. And it seemed utopian to think that we would ever be together, because there were all kinds of good, sensible reasons why people from Texas and Serbia should never get married. But there was something realistic about it because it was Torino and we were really together there. I mean, it was true. And a romance is a remote possibility that suddenly springs into real life. You can never exactly plan for that to happen. But when it happens, you become very aware of it. So it's not that I went to Torino or that she went to Torino, but rather that we went to Torino. And we do participate in the life of the city, but we're just not Turinese. I can't claim that we have any conventional purpose here at all. Nothing legal, nothing economic, nothing diplomatic, none of that, ever. Nothing that fits in a business plan or a government form. Mostly we're in Torino because in Torino we are us. In Torino, we became us. A rather mysterious and utopian quality for a city to have. So Torino's not utopia, but we do appreciate your kindness and your hospitality. So thank you for that, and that concludes my speech. Thank you for your attention.